PlayStation, they had that whole "you are not ready" thing going, and the date itself was like a big event.
You know, you look on the box and it kind of takes you a second to figure it out because it's spelled like "you are not," and then the E is red, so you're like, "You are not E, what does that mean?" And then, you know, you figure it out and you're like, well, okay. I just wasn't buying it at first, and you know, because I was a Nintendo and Sega fanboy, and you know, here comes these new guys, it's like, you know, why should I care about them? But came around eventually.
And that was one of the things that sort of made it stand out for me as one of the first big console launches.
Almost from day one, Sony Europe marketed the PlayStation to be a kind of hip lifestyle accessory. I used to go into nightclubs and see PlayStation pods in there. And then there was, I think the first big controversial thing, certainly that I remember, was I think at one of the big music festivals, possibly Glastonbury, they gave out postcards with, it was like a picture of some guy's face and a PlayStation logo. And the postcards were pre-perforated into tiny little rectangles so that you could break them off, roll them up, and use them as roaches when you were smoking things you shouldn't be. There was another really good one they did where they had some kind of mailing list, and they just did this mail shot of envelopes that were labeled test results, and inside were all these fake x-rays and like a doctor's letter and that kind of thing. And the deal was that it was supposed to be like, oh, you know, they found something horribly wrong with you, and the only way you can sort it out is to get yourself a PlayStation. And they got in a lot of trouble for that because I guess a bunch of the people who received those were actually waiting for test results from hospitals and that kind of thing.
And I was the first kind of employee of Sony Computer Entertainment America, and it was really a fun time. It was quite an ambitious plan. I initially had an office that was just kind of a few doors down from Tommy Mottola, and I had no idea who he was at the time. Mr. Mottola brought me into his office one day, and he sat me down and he said, "You know, Todd, I want you to know I have a daughter now, and I really love her quite a lot. And I want to make sure that the games that come out on the PlayStation are not violent and have, you know, nothing lewd or objectionable in them. And it's up to you guys to figure out, you know, how to set those standards." And I was, you know, thinking about rock and roll and thinking about kind of the environment that he lives in, sex, drugs, rock and roll. That's his world, and yet he was giving me a mandate, really, to make sure that none of that happened in the video game industry. And I had no control over it, but it was fun to kind of be there to listen to him and say, yeah, we'll do our best.
I got my first PlayStation by trading 30 Genesis games in for one. It seemed like a pretty good deal at the time because I wasn't working at the time, so I was between a couple of jobs. So I was like, well, hey, you know, if I can just turn these games that I'm not playing into a PlayStation, that's great. But now I totally wish I had all those Genesis games back.
I imported my PlayStation from Japan right around the time when it came out in Japan. I wire transferred like $900 and change to some guy in Japan that I didn't know who was going to give me a deal, and he did. He came through. I called him in Japan to make sure he was a real person and all that. He seemed legit, so I went with it. I got a PlayStation and memory card, an extra controller, Toshinden Ridge Racer, Killik the Blood, and Cyber Sled. And I was happy with that. I was set for that for a while, and then later I got Tekken and pretty much never played any of those other games again and stuck with Tekken for a very long time.
So 1997 rolls around and I've got like my first real job out of college. And I had before that I hadn't had a lot of money, and whatever money I had in college was like for beer and women. And I didn't pay for the women, but I did pay for beer. Just like every other PlayStation owner who only bought a PlayStation for Madden, that was me in '97. I just picked up a PlayStation and picked up Madden, and that was that. That was the beginning. Sort of my re-entry into gaming.
First new PlayStation I bought about a month after the system came out, and then a few months after that I was buying my next PlayStation because the first one didn't last.
So I was playing Final Fantasy VII. During a couple of the FMV sequences, my PlayStation kind of stuttered. The game froze. Basically, almost the entire rest of the time I played Final Fantasy VII, I flipped my PlayStation over and played it upside down. It was probably just a bad burn of a batch of Final Fantasy VIIs, but I believed I was helping by having my PlayStation play upside down, so that's the way I kept it.
If you had one of those probably millions of PlayStations from the first production run that overheated all the time, you probably remember the conventional wisdom was flip the PlayStation over and the heat would dissipate out the vents. We didn't have the internet where I lived in 1995, so I didn't know about conventional wisdom. So my solution was to prop the disc tray open with a paper clip and point a house fan at the system, which was not nearly as effective as flipping it over, which I found out in subsequent years.
I don't know what everyone's problem is. You know, everyone's like, oh, I went through 9 PlayStations. Oh, I had to buy 3. My PlayStation broke like 2 weeks later and I had to have it upside down. My PlayStation that I bought with all those Genesis games still works.
Still pissed off. 10 years later, I'm still pissed.